I am a state coordinator in West Virginia, which is the only state entirely within the Appalachian region. Where I live looks a whole lot like those scenes in eastern Kentucky. I live at the head of a holler. We don't have coal mining in my county, which is the only difference. Uh, I'm not a native to the state, but have lived here for 44 years. I love it here, and I don't consider myself a hillbilly. Uh, I'm hoping Barbara's with us. If we confirm that.
Yep, Barbara's here.
Okay. Our guest tonight, happy to introduce, is Barbara Ellen Smith, whom you just saw in the film. She has been active in writing about movements involving women, labor, and race in Appalachia and the South since the 1970s. Her most recent book is Digging Our Own Graves, Coal Miners and the Struggle Over Black Lung, which includes a photo gallery by Earl Daughter and was published at the end of last year by Haymarket Books. Also, any of you who have seen our short video, What Do We Owe Them? A New Day for the Coal Fields, Barbara Ellen wrote the What Do We Owe Them piece of that video. Barbara is recently retired from Virginia Tech and lives in Charleston, West Virginia. So I'd like to welcome Barbara, and just kind of odd. Shouldn't I be able to see Barbara? But Barbara, you told me when we talked earlier that work on this film started well before the Trump campaign and wasn't intended to follow Ashley and her family. Can you tell us more about the origins of the film?
So, and there we go. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for showing this film and for inviting me to comment and have a conversation about it. Yeah, I first met Ashley and Sally, the two filmmakers, well before 2016. I think it was at least 2014 when they approached me about, doing an interview so they could turn me into a talking head for the film. And at that time, Ashley described much of what is depicted in the film, her concern and despair even sometimes about the stereotypes and ideas directed at Eastern Kentucky and the wider Appalachian region. But Sally had a little bit different story. She, though she has family ties to, I think, East Tennessee, she had been spending a lot of time in New York City in sort of the rarefied atmosphere of the art world and independent filmmakers and so on. And she was increasingly appalled by the statements that would come out of the mouths of people who were otherwise extremely progressive, if not, radical, at least in their own self-estimation. But statements about, just these stupid crackers and dumb rednecks, hillbillies who don't know their own interests, what on earth they are bringing this country down, and so on. And so the convergence of Ashley's personal experience and Sally's experience in New York was part of what, at least as they described it to me, was motivating the film. This was, of course, well before the Trump campaign, but as they began to make the film and that campaign, accelerated the story of what Ashley was dealing with in terms of going back to her home in Eastern Kentucky and her family members and so forth became much more central to the storyline of the film. And I think it probably made it more personal in a way that becomes relatable to viewers. I'm not sure about that. I would be interested in folks' response. But in any case, it evolved. Films take a long time to make, and sort of history caught up with this one and changed it in the process.
I should mention that we'd like to encourage folks who do have questions if you can put them in the chat. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Barbara, what I was going to ask you next is how successful do you feel the film was at expanding understanding of Appalachia and its people? And are there areas where you think it could have done better?
Well, I definitely think that, in my view at least, it does a good job of expanding that understanding. Again, I think the proof is in viewers' response and how people who watched it tonight who may not have really thought about these issues respond and feel about the film. But, you know, Appalachia is an incredibly complicated set of stories. It's an imagined place. It's an invented region in many ways, as the film describes. Really became a region for various sort of instrumental reasons in the late 19th century. It's a wide body of literature. It's the lived experience of people who are residents of the region, but it's also a place of incredible diversity, both by gender, race, sexual identity, and so on, as the film, I think, tries to show. But it's also, and this is harder to do in you know, one documentary, it's a place of great diversity by subregion. I mean, as you mentioned, Jim, there are many parts of the film that were quite familiar, but you live in a county where there's no coal mining, which of course is central to the story in the film. And, you know, places like East Kentucky are really different from Western North Carolina, which is different still from Northern Alabama. And all of this sort of hodgepodge of places got defined as Appalachia in the course of a lot of political horse trading that defined the region for federal purposes too. So there's many layers of definition to the region, but, you know, and of course, volumes upon volumes about it. So in the course of an hour and a half documentary, I think they did a pretty good job of showing some of that complexity and diversity, as well as, of course, critiquing the stereotypes that are imposed on the region and how they function in harmful ways. You know, you asked if there's anything they might have done better. I don't know that it's better. It does get mentioned in the film, but one of the things that I think is incredibly important to underscore is the idea that hillbillies, that imagery and all of the pejorative ideas about the region are not just about people who live in the mountains. You know, the wealthy retiree in Western North Carolina living in a 5,000 square foot home made of cedar and glass and looking out on the Smokies is not a hillbilly, right? Hillbilly it's very much a class loaded term. It's about poorer people. It's about working class people. And so that's, I think that is a thread in the film, but it gets lost sometimes in the notion of just sort of insiders and outsiders, people who live in the region, people who don't, and by definition don't understand it either.
I read some reviews of the film. Some were from people who had watched it, and one viewer thought the film focused too much on politics. And quoting this viewer, quote, "We have love, community, and pride that makes us among the luckiest of people." I like that quote. How important do you feel politics are to the story of Appalachia?
Well, I think they're incredibly important, but I would also say to the person who made that comment that two things. One, I think people all over the world would lift up, I mean, many people all over the world would lift up the fact that they have a love of community and family and pride in their place. And I think actually that the film does a remarkable job, partly because of Ashley's story, of showing that, you know, that despite this incredible polarization that we have been experiencing, that her capacity and her family's capacity to embrace her and their different points of view is just a real affirmation. And, you know, so many of us have struggled with that and have been very much at odds within our families over politics during these last 4 years, if not longer. So anyway, just in response to that viewer's comment, I think that I think the film actually does a really good job of affirming love, community, pride in a context of potential for real rupture and division. But in terms of the political questions specifically, or whether politics are really necessary in terms of understanding Appalachia, I would say absolutely. And by politics, I don't mean just electoral politics, much less the specifics of the Trump victory and the voting strength in the region, but more politics as power and power relations. I think the film does a pretty good job of showing how the whole idea of Appalachia really came to be in the context of self-interested industrialists who were seeking to exploit the region and open it up for first timber, railroads, and then coal production. And this notion of a backwards place, of a place where people were illiterate and kind of amoral, even barbaric, who really needed the enlightenment that industrial capitalism was supposedly going to bring them, is very much a part of the story of the region. And obviously, persists to this day in terms of the kind of ideological power of the coal industry, even as it's collapsing. And I think that in terms of the contemporary situation, the coal industry has been extremely shrewd at not allowing itself to be depicted as sort of outside corporate interests, or at least trying to defuse that by launching this Friends of Coal campaign, which positions the coal industry as insiders against those awful outsider, often environmentalists, right? Radical environmentalists who by definition are all from the outside the region. Of course, it's not true, but whereas the coal industry, aligns itself with the real people, and we are friends of coal and so on. And so that whole kind of political dynamic, I think, is incredibly important to understand, certainly for environmentalists, because in that sort of rhetoric and in that insider-outsider dynamic, to be a coal miner or in a coal mining family is not just a paycheck or even a way of life. It's like a badge of honor, as the coal industry rhetoric and propaganda puts it. We power the nation, we keep the lights on, and so on. Even though, of course, that's increasingly not the case. It's very much an appealing kind of source of pride, specifically in a context where people get trashed for being from the region or being coal miners or backwoods hillbillies. So being able to participate in this sense of sort of being central to national progress and identity and history and so on is really key. And key is a source of pride and identity. And I think we fail to understand that at our peril. So yeah, politics is, I think, pretty fundamental.
So I thought this was a pretty good question. How much do you think connection to place overcomes divisions of D versus R and divisions of race, et cetera, connection to the land and landscape? And I just want to respond to that one quickly, and then I'll let you take it, Barbara. But how many times I've heard from people that have moved out of West Virginia and find their way back, and they just say how much they long to be back in West Virginia, how much they miss the place. I think there's a very strong sense of place associated with this area. I know that I have it at this point. I would miss it if I left. And I think that's an important thing to think about when we're in our work with CCL, the things that we try to find that we have in common with folks. We have those kinds of things that we can look to that we have in common, a sense of the land. So you want to take a shot at that one, Barbara?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's certainly something that I've found in my own experience in the region and also in my family's experience in the region. I would say though that of course, as we all know, people's understanding of place are different, and that was really evident in the struggle over mountaintop removal, where of course for some people defensive place meant trying to outlaw or abolish mountaintop removal, and for others it was an important part of participating in both economic vitality, but also a kind of national participation and pride. And so I do think that attachment to place can be very much a source of collaboration and common ground, but it is also so tricky.
Would Appalachia be open to the idea of a just transition if it offered jobs and training, as well as assistance for education and green construction? I think that a lot of folks would be open, but Barbara, maybe you can also address this. And I mean, you hear this about with coal miners that it gets in their blood. Earlier on the labor session, a former coal miner was talking about how it becomes a part of you, and how coal miners relate to one another from the work that they do. And so how much of a transition do you think is just about a job, and how much of it is about tradition and those kinds of emotions?
Well, yeah, the emotional attachment to coal mining, even in a context where it's been so harmful to the land as well as to people's health and lives, I think is absolutely something to consider in terms of trying to promote a just transition. That said, I have never spoken to a coal miner, and I've spoken to a whole lot of them, who said, I want my son or daughter these days to go in the mine. Not a one. Historically, the idea that I don't want you going in those mines, I don't want you dying of black lung like it's suffocating me. I don't want you to die in a roof fall. The mines are my life, but they're not my friend. I mean, there's a deep attachment, but also a deep ambivalence about mining. People know its legacy. I mean, they've lived it in terms of its harms. So, but I think the proof is in the jobs. Massive investment in the region, job development, with, of course, living wages and fringe benefits and so on, health insurance, pensions. I think that could turn people around pretty quickly, but it's got to be like massive and widespread. It can't just be a little demonstration project here or there. We're talking just a huge turnover that's required. Yeah.
Well, at first I didn't think we were going to get any questions, and now they're pouring in. So, what do you think about whether or not these stereotypes about hillbillies are essentially racist?
I think that's a really important question, and I'm glad that it got raised, because a lot of folks in the region who recognize, as I think the film points out, some of the racial logic in the stereotypes, that is, the idea that you're lazy, the idea that you're sexually immoral, the idea that you're violent. Clearly, these are kind of images that have been applied to people of color, and specifically African American people in this country. So, there are white people who live in the region who conclude, well, we are victims of racism too. And I would argue that we don't want to go there for for two reasons. Basically, I think that on the one hand, that risks really underestimating the structural racism and just the whole architecture of racism against people of color in this country. But it also misses the point that I think what's going on in these stereotypes often is the use of the language of racism and images of racist stereotypes really to talk about class. That is to say, to talk about poor and working class people, as Bell Hooks says early on in the film, you know, to have people who are white, but still really impoverished and unable to make it is just an affront to the American dream. And so I think, you know, we live in a society where we don't have a very robust language or understanding of class. We tend to think in terms of meritocracy. You know, if you made it, then your own talent and effort, and if you didn't, then something must be wrong with you. As you know, in contrast to a lot of other, you know, industrial capitalist countries in Europe, for example, where they have a strong labor movement and so on, and I think a much more sophisticated understanding of class. We tend to talk about class through race, right, and put people down in racist terms because they're poor or working class, without understanding that, you know, class is about exploitation. It's about some people being rich because they can make their money off of underpaying and exploiting other people. That's just not part of our popular consciousness. So yeah, I would argue that they're not, that they borrow the language of race, but they are not evidence of racism per se against white people in that flesh.
Okay, so kind of a long question from John. Barbara, do you have specific evidence of coal and other interests specifically portraying Appalachians as Hicks, et cetera, or other permutations of the sort of PR campaigns in the interests of their exploitive practices? He refers to a couple of folks here, Stuart Ewan, I can't talk, Elizabeth in typecasting.
Yeah, there's a number of books written about this, you know, that focus on the late 19th century and on the ways in which the sort of captains of industry depicted the region. And it's complicated because, you know, part of it was clearly sort of disparaging and facilitated their own interest in exploiting the land and the people. And obviously, you know, explicitly the mineral resources. Tony Harkin's book, Tony Harkin is in the film. He has a book called Hillbilly, which is about the sort of history of the notion of hillbillies, which goes into some of that. There's a number of articles and, you know, a lot of material actually that demonstrates that tendency. There was also a tendency a little bit later to do in some ways the opposite, but I would argue it's just the flip side of the coin, which is to say to romanticize white people in the mountains as the true salt of the earth, our contemporary ancestors, as one person put it, people who had been sort of protected from modernization and represented pure Anglo-Saxon stock. So again, kind of racist notion, but a romanticized notion of the mountains too. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. I can
question. I'm sorry. Did I jump in too quick?
No, go ahead.
Okay. How did they ever break the coal unions?
Oh, well, read my book. It's a very sad story. And the, you know, if you know anything about the history, the labor history of places like Southern West Virginia, they were the sites of enormous, prolonged, bloody struggles over unionism, the Battle of Blair Mountain, the Battle of Matewan, Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, and so on. And it was precisely in that area, though, that 18 Massey specifically in the early 1980s decided to go against the union. And this, of course, was a time when the courts were going against unions. The Reagan administration busted the union of air traffic controllers early on in his first term. So there was just a tidal wave of anti-unionism and a lot of support from the courts and the Congress for rolling back any union protection. You get right to work laws spreading across the country and so on. And it's in that context that 18 Massey decides to move against the union. And, you know, he spent reportedly, he meaning Don Blankenship, and they've heard him, the head of Massey, Southern West Virginia division anyway at the time, spending $200,000 a month just on security. They had armored personnel carriers, they had surveillance cameras, they had, you know, scab workers that they brought in helicopters and so on from other locations. And, you know, they were ultimately able to break the union such that you couldn't get a job unless you worked non-union. But the really divisive dynamic in that process was the fact that some people crossed union picket lines. And one of the miners that I interviewed about this whole process talked about how Don Blankenship, who was from that area, was very shrewd. He knew people, he knew families, he understood sort of the social web of union and kinship and community connections, and he made it his business to encourage individuals that, you know, in key families and key locations to cross the picket line and work non-union. It was incredibly divisive. And he finally won out. But in central Appalachia, which is southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwest Virginia, only about 7% of underground miners are now in the union, working miners, which is just, it's an unbelievable decline from, especially in southern West Virginia, being almost 100% decades ago.
And how did coal mining affect Appalachia's population? Did coal bring a lot of people to the area, or were most of these families already there?
No, historically, the coal industry had to recruit workers when they began to open up the coal fields in places like eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, southwest Virginia. These were very, very rural, sparsely populated areas. And so what you saw was a massive recruitment effort, not only in the South, particularly African-American workers who were encouraged to move north and work in the mines, but also immigrant workers, you know, late 19th, early 20th century, this is a time of extensive immigration to the United States. And a lot of those folks were encouraged to come to the coal industry, men specifically, and, you know, their families if they had them. So the early efforts at unionization, to go back to the prior question, were really remarkable, multiracial and, in a sense, multinational and multilingual efforts. There's a film by John Sayles, Mate One, which is very much worth watching. It depicts the struggle over unionism in Mate One in Mingo County in southern West Virginia, and I think captures very well the kind of diversity of the coal mine workforce at the time.
So there's been a couple of questions, and I'm going to respond to this some. Couldn't the national heroic role of coal transfer to green shift to power the nation? And I don't know how many times I've heard our Senator Joe Manchin in the last few months make the comment, if you want to build wind generators, we'll build you the best wind generator in the country. I mean, it's a favored line of his these days. But yes, I think in West Virginia, that's one of our strategies is at this point is why can't we still be an energy producing state, but just be producing green energy instead? And there are different ways. There's been talk about turning mountaintop removal sites into industrial scale solar farms. there, are ways to like pump water, pump storage facilities to pump water out of abandoned mines. Then, let it run back down and create electricity. There are a lot of ways that we can be turning green in West Virginia. And so that's my take on that. Do you have any response to that, Barbara?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that, as I was saying earlier, that the investments need to be really extensive and accompanied by a real campaign to suggest that, point to what you're saying, Jim, in terms of being, the heart of the nation still in terms of energy production, but of a different kind.
So here's one question that kind of goes to, I'm going to paraphrase it. Why do you see so many Friends of Coal bumper stickers? Quite the original question is, so why do people support the coal companies? But boy, both in Kentucky and West Virginia, you see a lot of Friends of Coal stickers on windshields and back windows and bumpers.
And yeah. Well, I think, a couple of things. One is, as I was talking earlier about the destruction of the union, I think the destruction of the union was part of the precondition for being able, for coal operators who financed the Friends of Coal campaign, to be able to pull it off successfully. Once you don't have a union that sort of stands between workers and the boss and can, and sometimes did, suggest a different explanation and a different storyline about what was going on in the coal industry. Once that's gone and you're feeling embattled for your jobs, your livelihood, your way of life, and the industry is very quick to pick up on that and amplify that with this campaign about how, we're your buddies, guys. We're in this together. That damn Obama and those environmentalists and so on are ready to just run us into the ground, out of business. Join with us. It's in a context of, really widespread economic insecurity and a legacy, a history of coal mining. It's in some ways, obviously it's incredibly unfortunate, but it's also not surprising that it could be so successful. There's some interesting research on that again that also points to this idea of, coal built a nation. Of course, it was coal miners who built the nation, not just coal. But the industry doesn't, tend to talk about the workers so much as just try to enlist them on its side in this kind of national patriotic ideology. But it's been very successful, unfortunately. However, as the industry declines, goes bankrupt, completely defaults on environmental obligations, as well as payments into Black lung disability trust funds, as well as pensions for miners and so on. Things are starting to shift a little. The coal industry is not looking so great for those who have worked for it for so many years and, in many cases are disabled with lung disease. So that's another part of the landscape that I think creates an opportunity for real green energy or alternative energy production.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to actually ask another one of my own. Do you think that the way that our country looks at Appalachia and coal miners is part of the reason why there's not more national concern and uproar about this increase in Black lung disease? It seems like there should be more concern. If the number of people in any other industry were coming down with a debilitating fatal disease, I think there would be a lot more media about it than there has been around Black lung disease. And I think you know something about that issue, Barbara.
I do, and I think Yeah, I would agree, Jim, that it's for sure partly because the resurgence, indeed intensification of disease is happening in Appalachia and to coal miners, who, a lot of people think coal miners, they're still coal miners. What the heck, It's alluded to in the film too, the idea that, folks are out of the 19th century. What are they doing, here in the 21st? So I agree with you. I also would say though that more generally, occupational disease among workers in all kinds of industry is grossly neglected. And there's kind of a class hierarchy in this too, which you can see even in for example, the concern about COVID. You don't get as much coverage of the poultry workers, or the folks who are getting exposed to the disease because of their employer's negligence or stinginess or whatever, as we do about more frontline workers or those who are considered more important. But yes, I would agree that for sure the inattention to this just ravaging effects of black lung and its resurgence is surely attributable in part to the fact that we're talking about coal miners and we're talking about Appalachia.
Well, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank you again, Barbara. I really appreciate you spending this time with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for what you're doing too.
Yes, I want to thank you to Barbara and Jim. Thank you so much for leading this discussion. And I want to thank all of you for sticking around tonight. I think this is an important film, and thanks to all of you. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.